fishwife.
What?
No, not the small. Fly.
And you notice how they behave. It's really baboon behavior, if you want to see how to behave.
I don't believe it.
Neither do I. Perhaps it's a dream.
I didn't think it was funny. No, I don't believe that.
How extraordinary that I don't feel excited.
Fawlty Towers was one of Britain's greatest comedy shows of all time. The show was incredibly funny and sharp, and even today, many years later, people still quote its best lines. However, the show only lasted 12 episodes before it ended. Many people wonder what really happened to cause this legendary show to end so quickly, the real hotel that inspired everything. The story of Fawlty Towers begins with a real hotel experience that was so bizarre it seemed like fiction. In 1970, John Cleese and his Monty Python friends were staying in Torquay, a seaside town in England. They were there to film episodes of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Instead of staying at a fancy hotel, they ended up at a seemingly ordinary place called the Glen Eagles Hotel. What they discovered there was anything but ordinary. The hotel was run by a man named Donald Sinclair, who was possibly the rudest hotel owner anyone had ever encountered. He didn't just treat guests poorly. He seemed to actively dislike having guests at all. Sinclair was suspicious of everyone who walked through his doors and had an amazing ability to turn simple conversations into complete disasters. One of the most famous incidents happened when Eric Idle, one of Cleese's Python friends, left his briefcase in the hotel lobby. Most hotel staff would either ignore it or politely ask who it belonged to. Not Sinclair. In a moment of pure paranoia, he grabbed the briefcase, marched outside, and threw it over a wall because he thought it might be a bomb. This was his solution to what he saw as a security threat at his own hotel. The strange incidents didn't stop there. When Terry Gilliam, another Python member, used his knife and fork with the wrong hands while eating, Sinclair stormed over to correct him. He acted as if using utensils incorrectly was some kind of serious crime. Sinclair also had a habit of rudely shouting at guests for the smallest reasons. When guests complained about the poor service, instead of trying to help, he seemed to enjoy making them even more uncomfortable. John Cleese, who was already known for his sharp eye for comedy, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He found Sinclair's behavior so ridiculous and unintentionally funny that he started taking notes. In Cleese's mind, this wasn't just a terrible hotel owner. This was pure comedy gold waiting to be turned into entertainment. Years later, when Cleese and his wife Connie Booth decided to create a television show, they knew exactly what kind of character they wanted to feature. This is how Basil Fawlty was born, an incompetent, bad-tempered, socially awkward hotel owner who somehow managed to make his guests' lives worse with every interaction. Cleese did exaggerate some of Sinclair's personality traits to make them funnier for television, but the basic character was all there in real life. From Basil's sarcastic outbursts to his complete inability to provide good customer service, Fawlty Towers was essentially a hilarious fictional version of Cleese's terrible experience at the Glen Eagles Hotel. What makes the story even more interesting is that Donald Sinclair apparently never realized he was the inspiration for Basil Fawlty. He died in 1981, never fully understanding that his disastrous approach to running a hotel had accidentally helped create one of the greatest comedy shows of all time. Creating the show, John Cleese didn't create Fawlty Towers by himself. The legendary sitcom was the result of a perfect creative partnership with his wife at the time, Connie Booth. While their marriage eventually ended in divorce in 1978, their creative connection as writers remained strong long enough to give the world one of the funniest television shows ever made. After their memorable stay at the Glen Eagles Hotel, Cleese and Booth couldn't stop thinking about the idea of an impossibly rude and incompetent hotel owner. They knew they had discovered something special, but it wasn't just about making Basil Fawlty yell at guests, although that was certainly part of the fun. They wanted the show to be packed with clever wit, ridiculous misunderstandings, and characters so extreme that they somehow felt real. When Fawlty Towers finally appeared on BBC Two in 1975, it didn't immediately become a huge success. In fact, some critics were completely confused by it. The British press wasn't showering it with praise, and one critic famously called it a disaster. However, the audience understood what the critics missed. People fell in love with Basil's never-ending anger, Sybil's sharp dominance over her husband, Polly's attempts to keep everyone sane, and poor Manuel's clueless but lovable behavior. The brilliance of the show wasn't just in its physical comedy, but in the complete absurdity of every situation. Every episode was like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Whether Basil was trying and failing to impress wealthy guests, Manuel was misunderstanding instructions with chaotic results, or Sybil was threatening Basil into submission with just the sound of her voice, something was always going wrong in the most entertaining way possible. Here's an interesting fact about the show's success. The BBC almost didn't give Fawlty Towers a second season. It wasn't until the first 6 episodes gained popularity through word of mouth and repeat showings that executives realized they had created something truly special. The second series came 4 years later in 1979, making Fawlty Towers one of the few classic sitcoms with only 12 episodes total. In the end, despite their divorce, Cleese and Booth worked together professionally until the very last episode. While that marked the end of their creative collaboration, their creation continued to live on. Decades later, Fawlty Towers is still considered one of the greatest British comedies of all time, proving that sometimes a little creative chaos can create television perfection. Critical reception and audience love. When Fawlty Towers first appeared on television screens in 1975, it wasn't exactly greeted with enthusiasm from professional critics. In fact, many of them struggled to understand its unique style of comedy. One critic famously called it a bit of a mess, while another questioned whether the chaotic nature of the show actually made it funny. Imagine criticizing a show about chaos for being too chaotic. It seems like they completely missed the point. While some critics were scratching their heads in confusion, the audience had no such problems understanding the show. They absolutely loved it. Watching poor Basil Fawlty desperately trying to keep his hotel running smoothly, only to have everything blow up in his face, really connected with viewers. Perhaps it was because we've all known someone like Basil at some point. Someone in charge who thinks they're in control but is actually a walking disaster. Or maybe it was the show's perfect timing, with every joke hitting exactly right. The cast was absolutely brilliant in their roles. John Cleese portrayed Basil as a whirlwind of frustration, sarcasm, and barely controlled rage. Prunella Scales played Sybil, his sharp-witted wife, who was clearly the real authority in the hotel, not that Basil would ever admit it. Andrew Sachs played Manuel, the well-meaning but completely clueless Spanish waiter, and Connie Booth played Polly, seemingly the only person in the entire hotel with a functioning brain. There's another reason the show became such a hit beyond just the jokes. Beneath all the madness, it had real depth. Basil wasn't simply a cranky hotel owner. He was a man constantly fighting with himself, desperately trying to climb the social ladder while being completely terrible at it. His outbursts were hilarious to watch, but they also showed his deep personal insecurities. He wanted to impress wealthy guests, but his own behavior guaranteed they would never return. Despite having only 12 episodes, yes, just 12, the show's impact was enormous. Viewers couldn't get enough of the brilliantly written disasters that happened in each episode. Reruns kept the show alive on television, and over the years, its reputation only grew stronger. By the time the British Film Institute ranked it as the greatest British television series of all time in 2000, it was widely accepted as a masterpiece, and the critics who once dismissed it had long since changed their minds. Even today, almost 50 years later, Fawlty Towers is still quoted, referenced, and loved by fans both old and new. It's proof that truly great comedy never becomes outdated. It only gets funnier as time passes. Controversies and criticism. Fawlty Towers is often praised as one of the funniest television shows ever made, but it wasn't all laughs and good times behind the scenes. While fans loved its outrageous humor, some moments created significant controversy. One of the biggest arguments revolved around an episode called The Germans. Most people remember the famous scene where Basil Fawlty, in his usual chaotic manner, stumbles through a series of cultural misunderstandings before delivering the now famous line, "Don't mention the war." The situation becomes even more ridiculous when Basil, trying his best not to mention World War II, keeps bringing it up in the most awkward ways possible. While this might sound harmless, it wasn't received that way by everyone. While British audiences mostly found it hilarious, partly because they understood it was making fun of Basil's own ignorance, some German viewers and even some British people felt the joke relied too heavily on old World War II stereotypes. Basil's over-the-top attempt to avoid the topic, only to blurt it out in the most embarrassing way possible, was classic Fawlty Towers comedy. However, for some people, especially those with personal or family connections to the war, it felt too close to home. The final straw for many critics was Basil's bizarre imitation of Hitler, complete with goose-stepping across the hotel lobby. This was played for laughs, but it was definitely a risky comedic choice that not everyone appreciated. Then there's the character of Manuel, the lovable but perpetually confused Spanish waiter played by Andrew Sachs. Manuel's broken English, thick accent, and physical clumsiness became signature comedic elements of the show. Audiences found his innocent, eager-to-please nature endearing, and his catchphrase, K, said whenever he misunderstood Basil's frantic instructions, became legendary. However, in later years, discussions began about whether Manuel was simply a harmless, funny character, or if he reinforced negative stereotypes about immigrants and people with language barriers. This debate became more intense as conversations about outdated television content became more common. In an era where streaming services carefully review their content, some Fawlty Towers episodes, including The Germans, were either removed from certain platforms or edited to remove specific lines. This sparked a new controversy. Fans argued that classic comedies should be viewed within the context of their time period, while critics felt that some jokes simply hadn't aged well. Even John Cleese himself expressed concern about this censorship, defending the show's satire as a way of making fun of ignorance rather than promoting it. He argued that the show was always making Basil the target of the jokes, not supporting his views. Despite all the controversies, Fawlty Towers remains a comedy treasure, with fans around the world still quoting Basil's rants, Sybil's sharp comments, and Annual's well-meaning mistakes. Whether you love it or debate it, one thing is certain: this show knew how to create discussion while making people laugh. Behind-the-scenes drama. Fawlty Towers created enough chaos on screen, but if you looked behind the camera, there was plenty of drama happening there too. The chemistry between the cast was electric, making every episode feel like a masterclass in comedic timing. But what fans didn't see was the emotional roller coaster happening behind the scenes. Let's start with John Cleese and Connie Booth, the show's creative masterminds. Cleese played the permanently frazzled Basil, and Booth played the ever-capable Polly. However, by the time the second season was being made, their marriage had already ended in divorce. Imagine having to work closely with your ex-spouse while pretending everything was fine. That sounds incredibly awkward, right? Yet somehow, they managed to pull it off. Not just professionally, but spectacularly well. There was no bitter fighting or drama on set, at least not from them. They were so committed to making the show successful that they put aside their personal differences, proving that good comedy waits for no one, not even a broken heart. Prunella Scales, who played Sybil Fawlty, was the woman who could strike fear into Basil with just a sharp "Basil." In real life, Scales was nothing like her bossy, no-nonsense character. She was warm, funny, and deeply respected throughout the entertainment industry. Scales once mentioned that she based Sybil on women she had encountered in the British upper middle class, those who could run a small empire with just a clipboard and a sharp tongue. She captured that essence brilliantly in her performance. Now let's talk about Andrew Sachs, the man behind Poor Manuel. If anyone truly suffered for his art, it was him. Playing the clueless but lovable Spanish waiter meant he had to endure a lot of physical comedy, and some of it was quite painful. In one famous scene, Basil hits Manuel over the head with a frying pea, and while this looks hilarious on screen, the first take used a real pan, which resulted in Sachs getting a nasty bruise. After that incident, they wisely switched to using a rubber version. That wasn't his only injury during filming. He was also accidentally burned during a kitchen fire scene. But like a true professional, he kept going, turning Manuel into one of the most beloved and most physically abused sitcom characters of all time. Despite all the behind-the-scenes drama, one thing was clear. This cast was completely committed to the show. They endured personal heartbreak, physical injuries, and long, exhausting days on set, all in the name of comedy. The result was one of the most iconic sitcoms of all time. It just goes to show that sometimes a little chaos both on screen and off is the secret ingredient to television magic. The controversial episode that nearly destroyed everything. One episode of Fawlty Towers nearly led to the show's complete downfall. Believe it or not, it was also one of the funniest and most controversial episodes ever made. We're talking about The Germans, the infamous episode that had audiences laughing hysterically while some television executives were sweating with worry. The storyline begins with Basil Fawlty suffering a concussion after an accident. Basil is already a walking disaster on his best days, but with a head injury, absolute chaos ensues. When a group of German guests arrives at the hotel, he tries his best to be diplomatic. His version of diplomacy involves repeatedly yelling at his staff, "Don't mention the war," before immediately mentioning it over and over again himself. The scene that really got people talking, and by talking, I mean angrily writing complaint letters to the BBC, was when Basil, in his concussed state, starts goose-stepping across the hotel lobby while imitating Adolf Hitler. It was classic Cleese, the comedy. Over the top, absurd, and completely ridiculous. While many viewers found it absolutely hilarious, the BBC faced significant criticism. The backlash was immediate and intense. Some critics labeled the episode offensive and tasteless, accusing the show of making light of World War II. Interestingly, German audiences had a more mixed response. Many saw the humor in it and appreciated the satire, understanding that Basil was the target of the joke, not the Germans. However, British television executives were genuinely concerned about the controversy. This led to serious discussions about potentially removing the episode from future broadcasts due to fears it could damage the BBC's reputation. The network was worried about offending viewers and facing more complaints. Despite all the outrage, the episode was never completely banned, and it continued to air for decades, becoming one of Fawlty Towers' most iconic and memorable moments. In recent years, as attitudes toward comedy and political correctness have changed, The Germans has faced fresh scrutiny. Some networks have temporarily removed it from their streaming services, while others have aired edited versions that remove certain lines and scenes. John Cleese, never one to avoid controversy, has strongly defended the episode. He argues that it was meant to make fun of Basil's stupidity and ignorance, not to glorify anything offensive. After all, Basil Fawlty is always the target of the jokes in every episode. He's rude, clueless, and constantly making things worse for himself. That's what makes Fawlty Towers so brilliant as comedy. So did The Germans really almost destroy Fawlty Towers? Not quite. In fact, the controversy only added to the show's legendary status. It proved that great comedy can walk a fine line between genius and outrage, creating discussions that last for decades. Even today, the episode remains one of the most talked-about moments in British television history. What happened to the cast? The cast of Fawlty Towers went on to have very different lives after the show ended, with some continuing in entertainment while others chose completely different paths. John Cleese, the mastermind behind Basil Fawlty, certainly didn't stop creating after Fawlty Towers ended. He went on to co-create the legendary comedy film A Fish Called Wanda in 1988, which became a huge hit worldwide. He also became a familiar voice in animated films, playing King Harold in Shrek 2 and voicing Kaa the Snake in The Jungle Book. Even in his 80s, Cleese refuses to slow down. In 2023, he shocked fans by announcing plans to revive Fawlty Towers alongside his real-life daughter, Camilla Cleese. The reboot was set to be released in 2024 and promised to bring Basil into the modern era. Whether this is a brilliant idea or a risky one remains to be seen. Connie Booth, who played the ever-capable waitress Polly, made a completely unexpected career change after Fawlty Towers. She left acting behind entirely and trained to become a psychotherapist. Talk about a surprising plot twist. Despite co-writing the show with John Cleese, who was also her husband at the time, Booth became increasingly private after their divorce. She rarely gives interviews, and in recent years, she has lived a quiet life away from the entertainment industry. No reunions, no conventions, just a peaceful existence far from Basil's hotel chaos. Prunella Scales, who played the ever-nagging but hilariously sharp Sybil Fawlty, enjoyed a fantastic career long after Fawlty Towers ended. She appeared in films like Howard's End in 1992 and television shows such as Mapp and Lucia in 1985. Sadly, in recent years, Prunella has been battling vascular dementia. Her husband, actor Timothy West, has spoken openly about how her memory is fading, but her sense of humor and warmth remain intact. Even in her struggles, she remains an inspiration to many. Andrew Sachs, thus, a man behind the lovable yet clueless Manuel, continued acting well into his later years.